Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters. I'm your host, Liz Lang. Each week on this podcast, we will break down various aspects of mental health. We are so excited you're here and hope you enjoy this week's episode. Hey guys, Liz Lang here with Jeremiah and Selina Woodruff, and this week we are going to get into why teens need both independence and boundaries, which is a perfect topic for me in my life because that is my life. My oldest is 12, and we are trying to navigate this whole idea of setting boundaries and how to let her be independent while also still trying to protect her. And it's a bit of a huge power struggle. So we're going to go into that. Jeremiah and Selina have some good examples as well to share with us. But let's just start out about this developmental drive, right? And how as teens get older, they genuinely need more independence and kind of why we have to give it to them, like why we can't just control everything that our 16-year-old does, why that's not going to work.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. We're glad to be back here with you. And, we talked a little bit about that developmental stage last week with teens and that desire for independence because they really want to figure out who they are and they don't want mom and dad to control their lives. And the reality is it's not good for them to have us control their lives. They really need to be independent. We want them to be independent. And part of producing or helping our children become independent is allowing them a little bit of independence within boundaries that keep them safe. And so that's what we hope to talk about today.
Adding on that, what we talked about last week was those development stages. And so when our kids are little and we want them to walk and they keep failing and they keep getting up, we kind of are more excited about that stage, right? We want them to walk, we want them to learn and have that independence too, and moving to that next development stage. And so along with this, if we have our mindset in that this is a development stage that is healthy and we want them to go through that development stage, just like we wanted them to start walking, we want them to go through that development stage.
Right. We've all heard like the horror stories of that college roommate who doesn't know how to do their laundry, right? Or, refuses to clean up after themselves. So, and it can be so hard because we want to protect our kids. And the world is a genuinely scary place, but they have to learn how to be in it and they have to learn how to cope and they have to learn what the dangers are for themselves, right? We can't. Hopefully, we're not going to college with our kids to do their laundry and cook their meals, right? So there's got to be that balance. So let's talk about trust and respect, right, in these two, because they have to be mutually beneficial, and especially that trust. That can, I think, be, at least from my perspective, it's been a really difficult piece. And so, my oldest wants to be on YouTube. And years ago, we set a very clear boundary, a non-negotiable boundary. You cannot just sit and browse YouTube unferreted, right? Like you're not just going to sit on a tablet somewhere and browse YouTube video after video after video. There's too much bad stuff that people put on YouTube. And so what we found is that she keeps finding ways around it, and we keep finding her on YouTube. And I feel like we just keep putting more restrictions and she just keeps going around them. It's tough, right? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, they are smart, and it is tough, and it can be challenging. And of course, I would always suggest that parents have certain safeguards placed on their internet so that we could, block out certain things, and you could utilize those devices and those tools to shut YouTube down altogether, so she wouldn't have access to it, at least at home. But I think that there's a lot we're going to talk about that might maybe open your eyes to how to set those boundaries and expectations and work with her on how to safely navigate that so that you can continue to build the trust and the respect. And that really is key. And it's interesting. And every time we talk about trust, I think about this with my kids. And one of the ways I've explained it to them is that trust is kind of fragile. you think about trust as like a glass plate. One poor choice shatters that plate. So if we drop that plate on the ground, it's going to shatter into a lot of pieces. And to gain that trust back means gluing all those pieces back together. And that can be incredibly challenging. But I think that sometimes, as I've thought about this, and maybe Selina, you could jump in here too, but I think sometimes as parents, they break that trust and we make it almost impossible for them to earn that trust back through good choices, because we always, well, when they did this, they made this poor choice and now I can't trust them anymore with it. But I think that we need to look for opportunities to allow them to build the trust and then to give them opportunity to test that trust and to continue working on it.
Okay. Yeah.
Of course, we need to be safe and protect them and keep them safe. It's not just giving them free reign on those things that they want to do. But again, going back to the walking, right? So in my experience, my children took a while to walk and they fell a lot of times, right? Mm-hmm. So if you apply that again to the situation, she's going to have times that she's going to mess up, or she's going to test those boundaries or explore and try to figure it out on her own, right? And so if you can keep that perspective that she's just like when she was walking, she's trying to figure it out. So if we can allow her those opportunities to fail, because that's what we're trying to prevent as parents, because why? Is it's negative emotion for us, right? And so we want to avoid negative emotion. But if we can be okay with allowing her to fail and look at that as opportunities for growth.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, really good point. Okay, so let's talk about this idea that maybe this is the piece that Curtis and I were missing, is that boundaries aren't about control, but it's about care. And it can be so hard as parents to convey that, because sometimes this boundary doesn't feel like care. Sometimes it just feels like control. So how do you help kids or teens understand that component?
Well, first I want you to clarify. Are you saying that they feel like you're trying to control them and that
yes.
you're okay? Because it's important to know that a boundary comes from love. Boundaries are not a way to control other people. So if you check yourself and can ask, is this boundary to control, or is this boundary coming from love?
And you're right that can be an important component on both sides, right? I mean, so, and that is, I think that's a great question for parents to ask themselves, is what is the point of this boundary? And, if your teen is just consistently pushing back, maybe it's time to evaluate the boundary, right? And then sometimes also, like, there's reasons that your teens aren't going to like, and it's just necessary, right? So I'm thinking of a boundary I had as a teenager. On the weekends I could stay out later, but on a weekday, I'm trying to remember what my dad said. I want to say it was like 9:30 or 10 o'clock, as long as it wasn't like a school.
Dang, he's nice.
Yeah. Okay. Well, and like, obviously there was exceptions. So I had school functions that would sometimes cause me to be out till 10:30. But, if I just wanted to be out with my friends, he wanted me home in a reasonable time. And I remember sometimes feeling this feels so restrictive, but really what it was a family coping mechanism, right? Because my parents wanted to go to bed at a reasonable hour, and my dad didn't sleep well when his kids weren't in bed. Like, he would not sleep well until everybody was at home, at least, right? Not necessarily in bed, but at least at home. And so that was the boundary that he set, and he explained it. And again, it's a kind of a fine line. Could it have been about just control? I don't think so. I think it was more about just family coping, right? And just family dynamics. And sometimes teens just aren't going to understand. For example, my 12-year-old still insists that YouTube is not dangerous for her. And eventually, is she going to have unfettered access to YouTube? Yeah. But at 12 years old, that still feels too young for me, right? So, tell me your thoughts on this idea of helping teens to understand and how to check yourself, right?
And that really is one of the great challenges of boundaries, is that you really have to look at the boundary as the parent, and maybe with your husband, and say, okay, what are we accomplishing with this boundary? Is it going to keep her safe? Is this still a necessary boundary for her? Is there an opportunity for us to adjust the boundary? The reality is you cannot control what she thinks about the boundary, whether she thinks it's going to be about control or about love. But what you can control is what you are doing with the boundary and why you're setting the boundaries. And certainly, I think explanation is always fair and appropriate. And I'm going to jump ahead just a little bit on what we were going to talk about, and help you see that one of the ideas is that we can work with teens, and we do this often with our kids and with clients that we work with, is we recommend that you work with them on setting the boundary. We sit down, we have a family meeting, and we say, okay, here's a struggle that we're having, or here's an expectation that we have. What are your thoughts, and how do we come to some sort of an agreement? And sometimes that can be helpful. And there's going to be some boundaries, you can't do drugs, right? Maybe
Right.
that's right. There's no option to move that. There's no discussion on that. It's just going to be a hard, fast boundary. And maybe your YouTube boundary is that way for you at home, and that's okay too.
Mm-hmm.
But working with your child to develop those boundaries and look at opportunities to explore maybe the adjustment of boundaries, but still in a way that you feel they could be maintain safety, kind of removes that idea of control from the boundary a little bit for them. But like I said, I think sometimes it's just going to be, they're just going to think it's control, and you might not be able to do anything about that. And you have a responsibility to keep them safe. So you may just have to move forward.
Right. So if there's a party going on and you as a parent know that there's likely to be alcohol at that party, you may have to make that decision, right? Do I trust my child to go there and not drink? Or do I just say, that's an unsafe environment, you're not going? And it's a delicate balance between that need for safety and that need for autonomy. And I don't think there's also always a clear cut, easy answer in that instance, right? Or instances like that where, it's easy to say, I don't want drugs in my house and I don't want alcohol in my house. That's an easy boundary to set, right?
Sure,
And
sure.
and I think one we can all agree with, because we all know drugs are bad and drinking is very much illegal for good reason. So I hope all parents have that boundary in their house. But, when they're going to go out into the world, you kind of have to just trust them.
So my question is, why do we need them to be okay with the boundary?
That's a really good question to ask. And my initial thought is it makes my life easier, but it shouldn't be about, but it shouldn't be about making my life easier. It should be what you kind of talked about earlier, a collaborative experience, right?
Again, repeating myself, you don't want to feel negative emotion. You want your child to understand. You want it to be easy. You want them to be happy and okay with it. So if you can be okay that your kid is not okay with the boundary, then it's easy to be okay with your boundary. You don't have to have reasons and explanation and for yourself, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think another thing too that is really critical, and this is in the outline as well, and that is consistency. And, I was thinking about this a while ago. It's really easy to give parenting advice and talk about good parental practices. It's a lot harder to implement in theory, right? Like to actually implement. And so I think for both me and Curtis, one of our struggles, and I'm sure all parents struggle with this, is consistency. Like once you set the boundary, you have to be consistent, or you might as well have not set it at all. And so, that can be a real struggle, is consistency.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. I wanted to jump back just a little bit and see if maybe you recognize something that you said a second ago. You said that, you want to make your life easier.
Mm-hmm.
That statement is very much a control statement. So you're trying to control, and the purpose of the boundary is no longer so much about safety, but about making your life better, which is not necessarily always going to be a bad thing. But when we look at the boundary that way, we recognize that it is about control, and your children will see it as control, not as this is what my parents are doing to keep me safe.
And that's a really good point, and as an initial gut reaction, I'm like, well, this is what I initially think, but that's not what parenting is about. If parenting was about making your life easy, then it wouldn't happen, right? Because they're parenting, it's not for the faint of heart. Okay, so let's talk about simple framework for setting the boundaries. Okay, let's dive into that. I'm curious what your guys' thoughts are on this.
Yeah, and I think this, again, like so much about what we talk about, it's so important to understand where you're coming from as a parent and what you want. I could sit here and tell you, well, you should have these types of boundaries with the internet or with screen time or with friends or whatever the case may be. But it really comes down to what is best for you and your family, and kind of exploring that. What are our standards? What are our expectations in our home? What do we want our family to look like? And when we start to develop those boundaries based around those things, and boundaries can change all the time, and they should, because as your children age, as you're experiencing now, the boundaries sometimes have to be adjusted, and sometimes they need to be adjusted in and tightened up a little bit to keep our kids safe. And sometimes we can open it up a little bit because we have more confidence that they're going to make better choices. So it really just depends on your family.
Well, it depends on each kid and each situation too, right?
Yes, yeah, this is true. I have a good kind of practical example of this. So, my two older girls, they have, especially in the summers, they have kind of free reign of our neighborhood. And granted, we live in a relatively safe neighborhood, but I'm able to, give them a pretty decent boundary, right? Or I guess a fairly open boundary of, yes, you can wander around the neighborhood to various friends' houses, but I have to know where you are at all time, right? Whereas my 5-year-old, he's too young. And we have this addition of special needs. So, because he's got a gastronomy tube, it's a lot harder for him to go somewhere without me, right? And so, again, it's going to be different for each individual. I think by the time my girls were 5, I was comfortable letting them go to the neighbor's house, without me actually being there. But with him, like it's different because of his special needs. So, as you said, Selena, it's just different for every kid, right?
Yeah, and I think looking at boundaries from a framework perspective and kind of being simplistic about it is, what does our family need? What do we want to have? What do we want this to look like? And what do these boundaries do for us? Right? Any boundary we look at, is this me trying to control my kids? Is this a safety thing? Is it something that's going to create contention? Is it going to help unify us as a family? Is it going to create connection? We can just ask ourselves those simple questions and start to build the boundaries around that. I think it's kind of tough to really just nail it out and say, do this, and this, and then your boundaries will be set.
Something to add on to that, talking about understanding if it's controlling or not, is another piece to ask is when your happiness depends on them fulfilling the request.
That's a good point.
So can you emotionally be unattached to the request that you have made with the boundary?
Okay.
If your happiness
depends
on them fulfilling that request, then I would question the boundary and if it's controlling or why your emotions are attached to it.
Yeah, that's another really good point, is just kind of that self-reflection and really asking yourself, why am I doing this, right? Or what is the point behind this? All right, another aspect of setting boundaries for teens that I am really curious to hear your guys' thoughts is how to recognize when they're ready for more responsibilities and when you can give them, and I don't know, would you guys call it more boundaries, less boundaries, or I guess how to know when to shift the boundary?
Yeah, that's a tough one, right? And I think that there's a lot to be said about a parent's instinct. you've got to pay attention to those instincts. We all have them. You can kind of see it. You can recognize what's happening if we're aware of what's going on with our children. We have good conversation and communication with them. They're open with us about things. And then we can certainly explore the idea of expounding or expanding the boundary. If we take your example you talked about earlier with your daughter and wanting more access to YouTube, I would take that as an opportunity to explore it. It may not be right to move the boundary out. It might be necessary to move it in. But I think anytime we start to see a little bit of conflict is one of the indicators that I would say, hey, let's reconsider this. Some kids, you might have boundaries and it's never even something that crosses their mind. Of course, you have a boundary that, okay, you can't date until you're 18. If we have that boundary and our kids aren't interested in dating, that boundary won't even matter to them, right?
Right.
We need to think about, hey, do we need to change this because they're 17 now or whatever it is? We can adjust it based on what's happening within their lives. And like we said 1,000 times already, every kid is going to be different. They're going to be unique and they're going to need unique boundaries and expectations that are tailored to them to help them develop and grow and become strong, independent, productive members of society.
So when you're coming at it with that perspective of this is to help them to learn and grow in this development stage, just like, again, walking, you could say, oh, kids start walking at 12 months. Well, some kids don't start walking till they're 18 months. Mm-hmm. Really just kind of knowing your kid and watching them and seeing, okay, is this something that they're ready to explore? And understanding too that we say all this about failing and them learning and growing, but us as parents, we're going to fail.
Yeah.
And what is that? That's an opportunity to learn, right? So you might ease up on the YouTube and then be like, whoa, this is not a good thing. That was not a good choice. And then so you can reevaluate and say, we're learning and growing and figuring this out. And Jeremiah already said some example of it's not always like they're doing so great and they're communicating and they're being good. So we need to open up this boundary. It could also be that you feel like, hey, things aren't going so well and this isn't working for us. We've got to rethink this and maybe see it from their perspective and what they could use to grow. And that might actually be like opening it up even when things aren't going well. And you wanted to share that experience in our own home. I'll let you explain that experience that we had.
Yeah. So, we were having a struggle with one of our children and, he was just starting to approach the teenage years. It was probably a tween at the time. I don't remember his exact age, but we were starting to really have a struggle with video games. Now, in our home, we have a boundary that's pretty strict on video games. We don't allow a lot of time on them, and we don't allow certain types of video games. But he was becoming irate when we would tell him, okay, your time's up. You don't get to play any longer. It's time to put it away, find something different. And we had this huge power struggle start and this big battle. And we started trying to think outside of the box. What do we do here? How do we address this? Because we didn't like it.
The answer was take the video games.
And that really, that's what I was just going to say is, yeah, like part of us were like, I guess he doesn't need video games anymore then, but what's really the answer? And it's not.
I wanted to make my life easier. I didn't want to deal with.
Yes. And
correct.
And that's relatable. All parents have been there. All parents have like, I just want this conflict to stop and I want it to end. It's a natural human response.
So let me tell you what we did and we did some research and we came up with this idea and I'm not even sure where we got it from at this point, but what we decided to do was we decided to sit down with him and say, okay, here's the deal. You get an hour of video games a day. You can play video games anytime you want to. You can play before school, after school. As soon as you get home, you can play in the evening. This is your bedtime. Here's the boundaries. You can play video games from this time in the morning till this time in the evening outside of school hours, whenever you want. Mm-hmm. But here's the expectation. We expect you to have your homework done, your chores done, and to get good grades, to get in bed on time, and all of those things that we expected. And as long as those expectations are met, you can play anytime you want. And he was like, really? I can? And he was so excited about this. And we're like, I hope we're not messing up here. Mm-hmm. And we said, you could come home from school and play. and then do your chores later. Because we were pretty strict, like, well, all your chores and all your homework and all this has to be done. And it was a lot of control for him. So we set this up. We set these very specific boundaries for him. We even told him, like, if you get ready early in the morning, you play before school. You play 30 minutes before school and 30 minutes after school, however you want to do it. And what ended up happening is within a very short amount of time, there were many days he didn't even play video games.
Interesting.
It stopped being a problem altogether. And to be honest, to this day, we haven't really had any big challenges with video games with him. And that was many, many years ago. What we found is that he was feeling like, well, I'm on the video game now, but I don't know if I'm going to get to play tomorrow because I have all this homework and these chores. And so he didn't ever want to let go of it because he was afraid of when he might not get it. And so when he knew, hey, I could do it anytime I want, it really opened things up for him. And he's like, it's okay. I'll play tomorrow. I'll play later today. It doesn't matter to me because I know I can go play whenever I want, as long as I fit within these boundaries. And of course, if he didn't accomplish his chores and his homework and things like that, then the next day he wouldn't have access to video games at all. And we never had to invoke that piece of the boundary. We never had to say, okay, you don't get video games tomorrow, not one time after that. And so it was kind of an interesting experience. So, and that may not work with, a different kid or a different one of our children, and that's fine. But sometimes as parents, we have to explore with the boundaries and, we have to allow them opportunities to grow. And something else I thought we should maybe bring up is there was another example. I had this individual from church that in a group setting said, I don't know why any parent would ever allow their children to have a smartphone. That is the most ignorant thing you could ever do. They're way too dangerous. And, when they're 18, then they can have one. And my response was, are you sure that's a good choice? Because we need to allow our kids opportunities to make mistakes. And sometimes making those mistakes inside of our home is the best place to make them, right? Where we can help them. But if you wait to give a boy a smartphone or ever have access to anything like that until he's outside of your influence and direction, maybe he moved out and now he's bought a smartphone, it's going to backfire on you. I can almost guarantee it. And so that's why we got to look at this like, okay, well, my kid really wants a smartphone and I'm willing to allow them to do that, but we're going to put boundaries on that smartphone. We're going to put certain restrictions so they can slowly start to learn. And guess what? They're going to mess up with it. They're going to go look at something they shouldn't have looked at, or they're going to go try and find a way around it, install the YouTube app and watch YouTube. And that's a mistake that they're going to make. And when they do that within our home, that's an opportunity for us to teach, not to lecture, not to punish, but to teach and to kind of explore the reasons why we have those safety features there for them. And we have those boundaries in place.
Right. Which, totally makes sense. And I particularly like what you said about the idea of cell phones. So we have to let our kids live in the world and experience the world. Parents, as I said earlier, we have this instinctive need to protect and shelter our kids from as much as possible. And there's a lot that we can protect them from, but the reality is they have to learn to grow and be functioning adults in an adult world and know how to safely navigate the world, right? And the fact of the matter is we live in a digital world. Technology is embedded into every aspect of our society and you can't fight it. All you can do is teach them. And so I think that's something that parents really need to acknowledge is teaching your kids how to safely navigate the world of technology, because it does provide so many wonderful aspects of our lives. I mean, you're listening to this podcast thanks to technology, right? You get a wealth of information. And so, we have to balance the need for safety and learning, like you said.
Most certainly. And allowing them opportunities to make mistakes. Yeah. Allowing our children to learn how to fail and to get back up from that is something that should happen in our home. And if we don't expand the boundaries a little bit and give them opportunity, how are they ever going to fail? Because when they get out in the real world and they get out on their own, I promise you, they're going to fail over and over and over again, because we all do. That's part of life. But if we can give them that opportunity at home to learn how to pick themselves back up, to move past it and say, yeah, you know what? Today I messed up, but I'm not a mistake. I just messed up. And tomorrow's a new day. I'm going to start again and we're going to make better choices. And I learned that because when you do this, this is the result. So I'm not going to do that anymore. We have to give them those opportunities. They're not going to learn from us just telling them, hey, you can't do that because it's not safe.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And there's also going to be instances, or eventually they're going to get to a point where you cannot control them, because eventually they're going to go out and they're going to get a license. They're going to, they're going to leave your house and they're going to make poor decisions. And if they haven't learned younger, it's going to be a lot harder for them to learn how to cope with that negative, or the negative consequences, right? So, I mean, kind of taking my example, is letting my daughter learn to fail or to break these boundaries that I've placed for her around YouTube. That's a small thing. That's a lot different than she's 16, she's got her license, and she's decided to drink and drive. So that's a situation. Those are those big mistakes that can have life-altering consequences that you want to avoid. And those big life-altering consequences can sometimes happen when we don't slowly give them freedom to choose and let them make mistakes. That's what can happen as a result.
Certainly. And they can also happen even when we feel like we've done all the right things, right?
Yes.
Those things can happen and it's difficult and tough, but we can work through that. And one of the things we're excited to talk about next week is a little bit about the results of us controlling our children through discipline or whatever it is. And so we're excited to talk about that next week with you, and we're going to dive into that more. But I think you really hit the nail on the head when you talked about, they need that opportunity. They've got to get out there. They've got to experience the world, and we have to allow that experience, but we get to allow it in areas where we feel more comfortable with them failing than in the big giant things. Maybe we can control the smaller things.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I think next week is when we're also going to get into, well, how to appropriately, I guess, counteract the breaking of the boundary, right? Or appropriately setting the consequences. Because that's another thing that I think we should touch on, is you have to be clear about what the boundary is, and then you have to be clear about about the results of the boundary being broken. Right? Because I think when you run into ambiguity in that instance, it's when it's a recipe for disaster. Because one thing that my kids are already starting to get good at, and I remember my parents dealing with this when we were teens, is they'll try to flex the boundary as much as possible. They're going to push the envelope, and they'll say, well, but this was different, or there was this reason for it. So, I think you have to just be clear in your expectation and clear in what the consequence is going to be.
Absolutely. And that's what we're going to get into next week. So we're excited for that.
Yeah. Okay. So next week, we're going to get into discipline versus punishment. And again, if you would like to get a hold of Jeremiah and Selina, I will once again have their website, Core Connection, linked on our show notes, and you can get a hold of them to book a free consultation. It'll also link them to all of their social media pages. And if anybody has any questions for Jeremiah and Selina, or if they would like to share stories or ideas for a future episode, send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com, and we are absolutely happy to do that. Do you guys have anything else you'd like to add?
No, it's just a pleasure being here with you today and discussing these fun topics of parenting.
Yeah.
Go have fun being a parent.
I think that's really good advice. And in the meantime, we hope you all have a good week and enjoy parenting. Have a question? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com.